If you haven't already, please take a second to subscribe to the channel, and also don't forget to click on the notification bell so you'll be up to date on all videos released from the Everything Network.
Carlo Gambino was a Sicilian-born American crime boss who was the leader and namesake of the Gambino crime family of New York City. Following the Appalachian Meeting in 1957 and the imprisonment of Vito Genovese in 1959, Gambino took over the commission of the American Mafia and played a powerful role in organized crime until his death from a heart attack in 1976. During a criminal career that spanned over 50 years, Gambino served only 22 months in prison for a tax evasion charge in 1937. Carlo Gambino was born into a family that belonged to a Sicilian mafia gang from Passo di Rigano. He had two brothers, Gaspare, who was not involved with the mafia, and Paolo, who was a part of what would become the Gambino crime family. His parents were Italian immigrants, Tommaso Gambino and Felice Castellano. Gambino entered the United States on December 2, 1921, at Norfolk, Virginia, as a stowaway on the SS Vincenzo Florio. He made his way to New York City to join his cousin and worked for a small trucking firm owned by their family. Gambino later moved to a modest house located at 2230 Ocean Parkway in Brooklyn. His Long Island residence, located at 34 Club Drive in Massapequa, New York, served as his summer home. The two-story brick house, surrounded by a low fence with marble statues on the front lawn, was at the end of a cul-de-sac in Harbor Green Estates, overlooking the South Oyster Bay. In 1932, Gambino married one of his cousins, Catherine Castellano, sister of future Gambino family boss Paul Castellano. In New York, Gambino joined a criminal organization headed by Joe Masseria, another Sicilian-born gangster. In 1930, Gambino was arrested in Lawrence, Massachusetts, as a suspicious person. That charge was dismissed, but he was seized a month later in Brockton, Massachusetts, on a larceny charge. A warrant was issued for his arrest when he failed to show up in court. 4 years later, he was arrested in Manhattan as a fugitive and was returned to Brockton, where the larceny charge was dropped when he made restitution of $1,000. By the early 1930s, Masseria found himself in a fierce rivalry with Salvatore Maranzano, the head of the Castellamarese clan, which eventually escalated into the bloody Castellamarese War. Some of the most conservative bosses worked only with men having roots in their own Sicilian village. After Masseria's death, Gambino and his cousins became soldiers in the family headed by Mangano. Despite being a mob power in his own right, Albert Anastasia was nominally the underboss of the Mangano family. During his 20-year rule, Mangano had resented Anastasia's close ties to Luciano and Costello, particularly the fact that they had obtained Anastasia's services without first seeking Mangano's permission. This and other business disputes led to heated, almost physical fights between the two mobsters. Gambino was arrested in 1937 for tax evasion related to operating a 1 million-gallon distillery in Philadelphia. He served 22 months in prison at the United States Penitentiary in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, the only period in his long criminal career during which he was incarcerated. In 1951, Mangano and his brother Philip were murdered, reportedly on the orders of Anastasia. Philip's body was found near Sheepshead Bay, Brooklyn, on April 19, 1951. Vincent's body was never found, and he was declared dead by the Surrogates Court in Brooklyn on October 30, 1961, 10 years after he had disappeared. In 1957, Genovese decided to move against Costello and Anastasia, enlisting Gambino, Anastasia's underboss, in the murder conspiracy. Genovese ordered Vincent Gigante to carry out the hit on Costello, which was attempted outside Costello's apartment building on May 2, 1957. Although the wound was superficial, the brush with death persuaded Costello to relinquish power to Genovese and retire. Although a doorman identified Gigante as the gunman, Costello claimed to not recognize him at Gigante's 1958 trial. Gigante was acquitted on charges of attempted murder. With Costello gone, Genovese and Gambino allegedly ordered Anastasia's murder. Gambino gave the contract to Profassi, who then allegedly assigned the hit to Joseph Crazy Joe Gallo. Anastasia was murdered on October 25, 1957, in the barbershop of the Park Sheraton Hotel in Midtown Manhattan. Gambino subsequently took over the Mangano crime family, which took his name going forward. He appointed Joseph Biondo as underboss, though Biondo was replaced by Aniello della Croce in 1965. Shortly after Anastasia's murder, Genovese took control of Luciano's crime family from Costello. Seeking to legitimize his new power, he called a meeting in which leaders of both the American and Sicilian crime syndicates would be in attendance. Among the items on the meeting's agenda were the Mafia's interests in gambling and narcotics smuggling in pre-revolutionary Cuba, as well as their interests in New York City's garment industry. The meeting took place on November 14th at the home of mobster Joseph Barbara in Appalachian, New York. Edgar D. Croswell, a trooper with the New York State Police, had become aware that Barbara's son was reserving rooms in local hotels and that a large quantity of meat from the local butcher was being delivered to the Barbara home. Suspicious, Croswell decided to monitor Barbara's house. When the state police found numerous luxury cars parked at the estate, they took down the license plate numbers and discovered the vehicles were registered to known criminals. Police reinforcements came to the scene and a roadblock was set up. When the mobsters discovered the police presence, they started fleeing the gathering by car or by foot. Many mafiosi escaped through the woods surrounding the Barbara estate. Gambino is thought to have attended the meeting, but was not one of the mobsters apprehended. The police stopped a car driven by Pennsylvania boss Russell Bufalino, whose passengers included Genovese and 3 other men. Bufalino said that Genovese had come to visit a sick Barbara, while Genovese himself said he had come to attend a barbecue. The police let him go. Gambino and Luciano allegedly helped pay part of $100,000 to a Rican drug dealer to falsely implicate Genovese in a drug deal. On April 17, 1959, Genovese was sentenced to 15 years in prison for drug offenses. He died in custody on February 14, 1969. On January 26, 1962, Luciano died of a heart attack at Naples International Airport. 3 days later, 300 people attended a funeral service for Luciano in Naples, during which his body was conveyed along the streets in a horse-drawn black hearse. With the permission of the US government, Luciano's relatives took his body back to New York for burial at St. John's Cemetery in Middle Village, Queens. More than 2,000 mourners attended his funeral. Gambino, Luciano's longtime friend, gave his eulogy. After Genovese's imprisonment, Gambino took control of the commission. Under his leadership, the Gambino crime family had 500 soldiers and over 1,000 associates. In 1962, Gambino's oldest son, Thomas, married Lucchese's daughter Frances. Over 1,000 guests attended the wedding, at which Gambino presented Lucchese with a $30,000 gift. In return, Lucchese gave Gambino a part of his rackets at Idlewild Airport, now called John F. Kennedy Airport. Lucchese exercised control over airport security and airport unions. As a team, Lucchese and Gambino now controlled the airport, the commission, and most organized crime in New York. In 1963, Joseph Bonanno, the head of the Bonanno crime family, made plans to assassinate several rivals on the commission, bosses Gambino, Lucchese, and Stefano Magaddino, as well as Frank De Simone. Bonanno sought Joseph Magliocco's support, and Magliocco, bitter over being previously denied a seat on the commission, readily agreed. Bonanno promised to make Magliocco his right-hand man in exchange for his assistance. Magliocco was assigned with killing Lucchese and Gambino, and he gave the contract to Joseph Colombo, one of his top hitmen. However, the opportunistic Colombo revealed the plot to his intended targets. The other bosses quickly surmised that Magliocco and Bonanno were colluding and summoned both men to explain themselves. Fearing for his life, Bonanno went into hiding in Montreal, leaving Magliocco to deal with the commission. Badly shaken and in failing health, Magliocco confessed his role in the plot. The commission spared his life, but forced him to retire as boss of the Profassi family and pay a $50,000 fine. As a reward for turning on his boss, Colombo took over Magliocco's family, which was subsequently renamed the Colombo family. His only prison term would come in 1966, when Colombo was sentenced to 30 days in prison for contempt of court by refusing to answer questions from a grand jury about his financial affairs. In 1970, Colombo created the Italian-American Civil Rights League. Later that year, the first Italian Unity Day rally was held in Columbus Circle to protest the federal persecution of Italians. In 1971, Gallo was released from prison, and Colombo invited him to a peace meeting with an offering of $1,000, which Gallo refused, instigating the Second Colombo War. On June 28, 1971, Colombo was shot 3 times by Jerome Johnson at the Second Italian Unity Day rally in Columbus Circle, sponsored by the Italian-American Civil Rights League. Johnson was immediately killed by Colombo's bodyguards. Joe Colombo was no stranger to violence. Growing up in South Brooklyn, one of the Mafia's spawning grounds, he knew from an early age the specter of gangster-imposed justice. When he was 16, his father, Tony, a made man, met an early and brutal death over some mob misdeed. Signifying a Sicilian-style revenge slaying, the bodies of his father and a girlfriend were found trussed and garroted in the back seat of a car. Drafted into the Coast Guard in World War II, Colombo served 3 years before being discharged early, suffering from psychoneurosis. It was a malady that cronies attributed to his theatrical skills, since he later never exhibited the slightest sign of mental distress. Briefly working as a longshoreman on the gangster-saturated Brooklyn docks, he switched to running crap games, and then found his calling as a proficient hitman for the crime family. Mob insiders credited Colombo with being in a squad that whacked at least 15 victims to resolve the boss's most troublesome problems. The Gallo brothers' war against Joe Profasci in the early 1960s turned out to be a good thing for Colombo's advancement. He remained loyal to the boss against the Gallos, and after the old boss's death, seemingly supported Joe Magliocco in his aborted quest for leadership of the family. Stellar service as a killer for the Profasci Magliocco faction earned Colombo a promotion to run a crew as a captain. But in the power struggle between New York's family bosses, he switched sides. Rather than backing Magliocco, he informed Carlo Gambino of the assassination plot by Joe Bonanno, with Magliocco's assistance to murder Carlo Gambino and Tommy Lucchese. Impressed with Colombo, Gambino, the aging leader of the largest New York family, adopted him as a protégé. Don Carlo's unqualified endorsement in 1964 eliminated any opposition to Colombo's ascending the throne as boss of the old Profasci gang. The family of over 200 soldiers and more than 1,000 associates was renamed the Colombo family, after its new boss. At the age of 41, Colombo was one of the youngest crime bosses in the country. He was also the first American-born boss of a New York crime family. When NYPD detective Albert Seidman, later the NYPD chief of detectives, called Colombo in for questioning about the death of one of his soldiers, Colombo came to the meeting without a lawyer. He told Seidman, "I am an American citizen, first class. I don't have a badge that makes me an official good guy like you, but I work just as honest for a living." Colombo's installation as a family godfather, with a vote on the commission at the comparatively young age of 41, rankled Mafia old-timers. An FBI wiretap in the office of Sam de Cavalcante, the boss in New Jersey, family named after him, heard him grousing to an unidentified caller about Colombo's unqualifications. Older bosses might envy Colombo's rapid ascension, but he knew how to fulfill the role of an established family boss. Upgrading his appearance, he outfitted his stocky frame in conservative suits and ties, and customed tailored shirts, trying to pose as a prosperous businessman. He took up golf instead of shooting pool with the boys. Colombo's real income poured in from illicit million-dollar gambling, loan sharking, hijacking, and shakedown rackets. But to appear legitimate, he became a salesman for a Brooklyn real estate company owned by an associate in his crime family. Overnight, the new venture capitalist was a partner in a funeral parlor and a florist shop. Those were popular front occupations for mobsters, and both of them were run by hirelings. The fictitious income from the salesman's job and investments that could be justified to the IRS allowed Colombo to adopt a lifestyle befitting his mob title. He moved his wife and their 5 children into a spacious split-level house in the Italian-American neighborhood of Bensonhurst, Brooklyn's middle-class version of Little Italy. For a more elegant and bucolic retreat, he acquired a 5-acre estate near the Hudson River, 100 miles from the city. A second-generation American, Colombo was far more articulate in English than Carlo Gambino and other immigrant bosses whose speech was heavily accented and grammatically mangled. And Colombo had no fear of going up against law enforcement officials and speaking his mind. In 1964, after a soldier in Colombo's family was gunned down, Albert Seidman, then a New York detective inspector, asked Colombo to appear voluntarily at a Brooklyn station house. To Seidman's surprise, the new mob boss showed up alone, without a lawyer, and unabashedly tore into Seidman. "If I was a Jewish businessman, you'd never dream of calling me down here on a murder," Seidman recalled, Colombo railing at him. 6 years later, Colombo pulled off an even more daring surprise. His son, Joseph Jr., was indicted in April 1970 on a rare federal complaint, a $300,000 conspiracy to melt down nickel coins and sell them as silver ingots. Instead of the customary mob tactic of retaining high-priced lawyers to win a courtroom acquittal, Colombo responded by staging demonstrations and picket lines outside of the FBI's Manhattan offices. The almost daily protests orchestrated by Colombo coincided with widespread national unrest over the Vietnam War and a rising clamor by African Americans, Hispanics, and feminist groups for civil rights and equality. With New York as the vortex of the national and international media, the novelty of a reputed mafia boss giving extensive television, radio, and print interviews catapulted Colombo into a media celebrity. He began appearing frequently on news and talk shows, expounding his views that the mafia was a myth, manufactured by law enforcement and the press, and that Italian Americans, like Black Americans and other minorities, were victims of FBI and police bias and brutality. The viewpoint, glibly expressed by Colombo and echoed to some degree by earnest, prominent Italian Americans, struck a chord in the Italian community. Dynasty and government agencies, fanned by opposition to the Vietnam War, was on the rise, and the public was acutely aware of the government's abysmal record of violations of, and indifference to, the civil rights of many groups. Colombo's son was acquitted in the Silver conspiracy case, benefiting from a standard development in mob-related trials. The key witness against 26-year-old Joe Jr., a former wannabe named Richard Salamone, had an abrupt change of heart in the witness chair, recanting earlier incriminating statements by suddenly stating that young Colombo knew nothing of the scheme. After the court victory, Colombo Sr. revved up his personal crusade. In less than a year, he formed and became the head of the Italian-American Civil Rights League, with a claimed dues-paying membership of 45,000 and 52 chapters in the nation. Harangues by Colombo and his followers against the FBI, law enforcement in general, and the press convinced thousands of decent Italian Americans that their community was being unfairly stigmatized as the Mafia. Deportation proceedings against Gambino were started by the Immigration and Naturalization Service as early as 1953, but made no headway for several years because of his heart condition and constant hospitalizations. In 1970, he was indicted on charges of conspiring to hijack an armored car carrying $3 million and was arrested on March 23, 1970. He was released on $75,000 bail and was never brought to trial because of his health. The same year, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld a 1967 order that he previously appealed that he be deported because he had entered the country illegally. When the government tried to carry out the order, Gambino was rushed to a hospital after he had suffered a massive heart attack. On June 28, 1971, Colombo was shot 3 times by Jerome A. Johnson, one being in the head, at the second Italian Unity Day rally in Columbus Circle, sponsored by the Italian American Civil Rights League. Johnson was immediately killed by Colombo's bodyguards. Colombo was permanently paralyzed from the shooting and later died in 1978. Although many in the Colombo family blamed Gallo for the shooting, the police eventually concluded that Johnson was a lone gunman after they had questioned Gallo. Since Johnson had spent time a few days earlier at a club run by the Gambino family, one theory was that Gambino organized the shooting. Colombo had refused to listen to Gambino's complaints about the League and allegedly spat in Gambino's face during one argument. However, the Colombo family leadership was convinced that Gallo ordered the murder after his falling out with the family. After Genovese's death, Gerardo Catena became the new boss of the Genovese family. However, he was indicted and jailed in 1970. Thomas Eboli then became the front boss of the family for the next 2 years. However, Eboli wanted to run the family for real and borrowed $4 million from Gambino to finance a new drug trafficking operation. However, law enforcement soon shut down Eboli's drug racket and arrested most of his crew. Gambino allegedly ordered Eboli's murder. While it was initially thought that this was due to Eboli's failure to pay back the loan, it is now believed that Gambino actually wanted to replace Eboli with Frank Funzi Thierry, and that Gambino used the loan as a pretext. Thomas Eboli worked as a professional boxer. In the early 1920s, during Prohibition, Eboli became a bootlegger for future crime boss Lucky Luciano. By the early 1930s, he had become the personal bodyguard for Luciano's underboss, Don Vito Genovese. Some sources claim that Tommy committed as many as 20 murders for the Genovese family. In 1933, he was arrested on 6 counts of illegal gambling and disorderly conduct. At some point during the 1930s or 1940s, Eboli became a boxing manager. One of his early boxing protégés was future Genovese family boss Vincent Gigante. On January 11, 1952, he assaulted 2 officials during a professional boxing match at Manhattan's Madison Square Garden Arena. On that evening, he was managing middleweight boxer Rocky Castellani, who was fighting Ernie "The Rock" Durando. After Durando knocked down Castellani in the 6th and 7th rounds, referee Ray Miller stopped the fight and awarded a technical knockout victory to Durando. At that point, an enraged Eboli entered the boxing ring and punched Miller. Later in Castellani's dressing room, Eboli kicked Al Weil, the boxing promoter. Sport writers later speculated that Eboli had expected his fighter to win due to an illegal arrangement with Weil. On January 23, 1952, Eboli was indicted on 2 counts of assault from the boxing incident. He pleaded guilty to reduced charges and was later sentenced to 60 days in prison, his only incarceration during a life of crime. The New York State Athletic Commission also banned him from boxing for life. When Genovese finally became boss, he named Eboli captain over the old Greenwich Village crew. Tommy was said to own several tourist nightclubs and gay bars in Midtown Manhattan and Lower Manhattan. He also controlled rackets on the Hudson River docks in Manhattan. He was also the owner of Jet Music Corporation, a jukebox supplier, and Tryon Cigarette Vending Service Inc. On April 17, 1959, Genovese was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, leaving Tommy as acting boss of the family. Gerardo Jerry Catena became underboss, and Michelle Big Mike Miranda became consigliere. Anthony Tony Bender Strollo became Eboli's top aide. Some authors claim that for the next 10 years, family decisions were made collectively by a committee ruling panel that included Eboli, Catena, and Capo Philip Lombardo. Other authors state that Miranda, not Lombardo, was the third member of this panel. On February 14, 1969, Genovese died of natural causes in prison, leaving the Genovese family hierarchy in turmoil. Eboli was a logical successor, but his health had deteriorated that year, plus he was under investigation. On July 28, 1969, Eboli suffered his third heart attack of that year. He was rushed to New York University Medical Center in Manhattan, where he eventually recovered. His previous heart attack occurred on July 17th, 2 days after appearing before the New Jersey State Investigation Committee in hearings on organized crime. He first suffered an attack in February 1969 at a New York State Investigation Commission meeting. However, both law enforcement and other mobsters believed that Eboli had faked some of these attacks. After Genovese's death, Catena became the new official boss. However, Catena was indicted and jailed in 1970. With Catena gone, Eboli now became the official boss of the Genovese family. However, Lombardo and Miranda were really in charge, and Eboli was just a front for law enforcement. Eboli continued as the front boss of the family for the next 2 years. However, Tommy wanted to be the real head of the Genovese family. On July 16, 1972, Eboli left his girlfriend's apartment in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, and walked to his chauffeured Cadillac. As he sat in the parked car, a gunman in a passing truck shot him 5 times. Hit in the head and neck, Eboli died instantly. No one was ever charged in this murder. Gambino died at his Massapequa home in the early morning hours of Friday, October 15, 1976, aged 74. Having watched the television broadcast of the New York Yankees winning the American League pennant the previous evening. The official cause was natural causes, and his death was not unexpected, given a history of heart disease. Cusimano and Russo Funeral Home hosted his wake over the weekend of October 16th and 17th. His funeral mass was held on Monday, October 18th, at the Church of Our Lady of Grace in Brooklyn. Gambino was then entombed within his family's private room in the cloister building of St. John's Cemetery in Queens. His funeral and wake were attended by several hundred people, with plainclothes police and FBI agents mingling outside. His funeral procession consisted of 13 limousines, around a dozen private cars, and 1 flower car. Paul Castellano was born in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, New York, on June 26, 1915. His parents, Giuseppe and Concetta Castellano, were both Italian immigrants. His father was a butcher and an early member of the Mangano crime family. Castellano dropped out of school in the 8th grade to learn butchering and collecting numbers game receipts, both from his father. In July 1934, he was arrested for the first time in Hartford, Connecticut, for robbing a haberdasher. He refused to identify his 2 accomplices to the police and served a 3-month prison sentence. By refusing to break the oath of the Mafia and cooperate with authorities, Paul enhanced his reputation for mob loyalty. His sister Catherine had married Carlo Gambino in 1932. Paul got married to his childhood sweetheart, Nina Mano, in 1937. The couple had 3 sons and a daughter. Paul joined the Mangano family in the 1940s and eventually became a captain under Alba Anastasia, the successor to original boss Vincent Mangano. In 1957, after Anastasia's murder and Gambino's elevation to boss, Castellano attended the abortive Appalachian meeting in Appalachian, New York. When the New York State Police raided the meeting, Castellano was one of 61 high-ranking mobsters arrested. Refusing to answer grand jury questions about the meeting, he spent a year in prison on contempt charges. On January 13, 1960, Castellano was sentenced to 5 years in prison for conspiracy to withhold information. However, in November 1960, his conviction was reversed on appeal. He identified more as a businessman than a criminal, taking over non-legitimate businesses and converting them to legitimate enterprises. However, his businesses, and those of his sons, still benefited from their mob ties. In his early years, he used his butcher's training to launch Dial Poultry, a poultry distribution business that once supplied 300 butchers in New York City. Paul used intimidation tactics to force his customers, which included supermarket chains Key Food and Waldbaum's, to buy Dial's products. As he became more powerful in the Gambino family, he started to make large amounts of money from concrete in the construction industry. His son Philip was the president of Scara Mix Concrete Corporation, which exercised a near monopoly on the concrete supply in Staten Island. Paul handled Gambino interests in the Concrete Club, a club of contractors selected by the Commission, the mob's ruling body, to handle contracts between $2 million and $15 million. In return, the contractors gave a 2% kickback of the contract value to the Commission. Castellano also supervised Gambino control of Teamsters Union Local Chapter 282, which provided workers to pour concrete at all major building projects in New York and Long Island. He allegedly had Vito Borelli, his daughter's boyfriend, murdered because he heard Borelli had compared him to Frank Perdue, the owner and commercial spokesman for Perdue Farms. In 2004, court documents revealed that Joseph Massino, a government witness and former boss of the Bonanno crime family, admitted to murdering Borelli as a favor to Paul. When Gambino died at his home of natural causes, on October 15, 1976, he appointed Paul to succeed him over his underboss, Neil Delacroce. Gambino appeared to believe that his crime family would benefit from Castellano's focus on white-collar businesses. Delacroce, at the time, was imprisoned for tax evasion and was unable to contest Castellano's succession. Paul Castellano's succession was confirmed at a meeting on November 24th, with Delacroce present. Big Paul arranged for Neil to remain as underboss while directly running traditional mob activities such as extortion, robbery, and loan sharking. While he accepted Castellano's succession, the deal effectively split the Gambino family into 2 rival factions, Delacroce's faction in Brooklyn and Castellano's faction in Manhattan. In 1978, Paul allegedly ordered the murder of Gambino associate Nicholas Sabetta. A cocaine and alcohol user, Sabetta participated in several public fights and insulted the daughter of George DeCicco. Since Sabetta was Salvatore Sammy the Bull Gravano's brother-in-law, Castellano asked DeCicco's brother Frank to first notify Gravano of the impending hit. When advised of Sabetta's fate, a furious Gravano initially threatened to kill Castellano first. However, he eventually calmed down and accepted Sabetta's death as a punishment earned by his behavior. That same year, Castellano allegedly ordered the murders of Gambino capo James Ippolito and his son, James Ippolito Jr. Ippolito Sr. had complained to the boss that Anthony Gage, another Gambino capo, was infringing on his territory and asked permission to kill him. Castellano gave Ippolito a non-committal answer, but later warned Nino about Ippolito's intentions. In response, Nino and soldier Roy DeMeo murdered Ippolito and his son. In February 1978, Castellano made an agreement between the Gambino family and the Westies, an Irish-American gang from Hell's Kitchen. Castellano wanted hitmen that law enforcement could not tie directly to the family. The Westies wanted Gambino protection from the other mob families. The Gambino-Westie alliance was set in a meeting between Paul and Westie's leader James Coonan. According to Westie's gangster Mickey Featherstone, Castellano gave them the following directive. "You guys got to stop acting like cowboys, acting wild. You're going to be with us now. If anyone is going to get killed, you have to clear it with us." The boss also forged an alliance with the Cherry Hill Gambinos, a group of Sicilian heroin importers and distributors in New Jersey, also for use as gunmen. With the Westies and the Cherry Hill Gambinos, Paul commanded a small army of capable killers. In September 1980, he allegedly ordered the murder of his former son-in-law, Frank Amato, for physically abusing his wife, his daughter Connie, when they were married. According to FBI documents, DeMeo murdered Amato, cut up his body, and disposed of the remains at sea. The following year, Purdue, the alleged cause of the 1975 Borelli murder, approached Paul for help in thwarting a unionization drive at a Purdue facility in Virginia. However, according to Purdue, the two men never made a final agreement. At the height of his power, Paul built a lavish 17-room mansion on a ridgeline in Tot Hill on Staten Island. Designed to resemble the White House in Washington, D.C., the mansion featured Carrara marble, an Olympic-sized swimming pool, and an English garden. Paul engaged in an affair with his live-in Colombian maid, Gloria Olarte. Castellano became a recluse and rarely ventured outside the mansion, requiring his capos to visit the residence to give information and receive orders. When not entertaining guests, he wore satin and silk dressing gowns and velvet slippers around the house. John Gotti, a former protege of Neil, became deeply dissatisfied with Castellano's leadership, regarding the boss as being too isolated and greedy. Like other members of the family, he disliked Paul on a personal level, feeling he lacked street credibility. Gotti also had an economic interest. He had a long-running dispute with Castellano on the split Gotti took from hijackings at John F. Kennedy International Airport. Furthermore, Gotti was rumored to be expanding into drug dealing, a lucrative trade Castellano had banned under threat of death. In January 1983, Castellano allegedly ordered the murder of DeMeo, who was found shot to death in the trunk of his Cadillac. 2 months later, the FBI obtained a warrant to install secret listening devices in his mansion. Waiting until he went on vacation to Florida, agents drugged his watchdogs, disabled his security system, and planted devices in the dining and living rooms. These devices provided law enforcement with a wealth of incriminating information on Big Paul. When Gambino members Angelo Ruggiero and Gene Gotti were arrested for dealing heroin, based primarily on recordings from a device in Ruggiero's house, Paul demanded transcripts of the tapes. And when Ruggiero refused, he threatened to demote John Gotti. On March 30, 1984, Castellano was indicted on federal racketeering charges, as well as extortion, drug trafficking, theft, prostitution, and the murders of Ippolito and DeMeo. He was released on $2 million bail. His legal challenges mounted in 1985. On February 25th, he was one of many mob bosses arrested on charges of racketeering, which was to result in the Mafia Commission trial, he was released on a $3 million bail. On July 1st, he was indicted on loan sharking charges and with tax evasion for not reporting the profits from an illegal racket, and pleaded not guilty. On November 4th, in a testimony from car thief Vito Arena, Paul was named the head of the stolen car ring that employed him, as well as having been connected to 5 murders. Neil Delacroce died of cancer on December 2nd, 1985, starting a chain of events that led to the boss's murder 2 weeks later. Castellano's failure to attend Neil's wake was taken as an insult by members of the Manhattan faction. Then, Castellano named Thomas Bellotti, a loyalist with little diplomatic skill, as the new underboss. Castellano also hinted that he planned to break up John Gotti's crew. Gravano suggested killing both Castellano and Bellotti while they were eating breakfast at a diner. However, when DeCicco tipped Gotti off that he would be having a meeting with Castellano and several other mobsters at Manhattan's Spark Steakhouse on December 16th, Gotti and the other conspirators decided to kill him then. On Monday, December 16th, 1985, Bellotti drove Castellano to the pre-arranged early evening meeting at Spark Steakhouse. A hit team, consisting of Salvatore Scala, Edward Lino, and John Carneglia, waited near the restaurant entrance. Positioned down the street were backup shooters Rogero, Dominic Pizzonia, and Tony Rampino. Gotti and Gravano observed the scene from a car across the street. As Castellano was exiting the car at the front of the restaurant at around 5:26 p.m., the gunman ran up and shot him several times. Allegedly, Carneglia delivered the fatal shot to Castellano's head. Bellotti was shot as he exited from the driver's door. Before leaving the murder scene, Gotti drove over to view the bodies. 2 weeks after the murder, Gotti was elected as the new boss of the Gambino family. Vincent Gigante, the boss of the Genovese family, was outraged that Gotti had killed Castellano without following Mafia protocol and solicited the help of Lucchese family boss Anthony Carlo in carrying out a hit. On April 13, 1986, a car bomb meant for Gotti exploded outside a Bensonhurst social club, but the only casualty was Frankie DeCicco. As a teenager, Gigante became the protege of future Genovese crime family patriarch Vito Genovese, who had helped pay for Gigante's mother's surgery. Between the ages of 17 and 25, he was arrested 7 times on charges ranging from receiving stolen goods, possession of an unlicensed handgun, and illegal gambling and bookmaking. Most were dismissed or resolved by fines, except for a 60-day jail stay for a gambling conviction. During this time, Gigante listed his occupation as a tailor. In the 1960s, the Chin took to walking around his neighborhood in a bathrobe, pajamas, and slippers while mumbling to himself, which law enforcement agents, prosecutors, and mafia defectors would later describe as a staged performance intended to allow Gigante to avoid prosecution for his criminal activities. This would come to be known as the bathrobe defense, in which those accused of criminal wrongdoing would feign mental incompetence to avoid the legal consequence of such behavior. In early 1957, Vito decided to move on Luciano family boss Frank Costello. Don Vito ordered Gigante to murder Costello, and on May 2, 1957, Gigante shot and wounded Costello outside his apartment building. Although the wound was superficial, it persuaded Costello to relinquish power to Genovese and retire. Don Vito then controlled what is now called the Genovese crime family. In 1958, Costello testified that he was unable to recognize his assailant. Gigante was acquitted on charges of attempted murder. In 1959, he was convicted with Don Vito of heroin trafficking and sentenced to 7 years in prison. He was paroled after 5 years. Not long afterward, he was promoted from soldier to captain, running the Greenwich Village crew, and headquartered at the Triangle Civic Improvement Association. In 1969, the Oddfather was indicted in New Jersey for conspiracy to bribe the entire 5-member Old Tappan, New Jersey police force to alert him to surveillance operations by law enforcement agencies. The charge was dropped after Gigante's lawyers presented reports from psychiatrists that he was mentally unfit to stand trial. In 1981, Genovese's successor, Philip Benny Squint Lombardo, stepped down as boss due to poor health. With Lombardo's support, Gigante became boss of the Genovese family. Anthony "Fat Tony" Salerno was made front boss of the Genovese family in order to fool law enforcement. Gigante built a vast network of bookmaking and loan sharking rings, and from extortions of garbage, shipping, trucking and construction companies seeking labor peace, or contracts from carpenters, teamsters and laborers' unions, including those at the Javits Center, as well as protection payoffs from merchants at the Fulton Fish Market. Gigante also had influence in the Feast of San Gennaro in Little Italy, operating gambling games, extorting payoffs from vendors, and pocketing thousands of dollars donated to a neighborhood church, until a crackdown in 1995 by New York City officials. On April 13, 1986, Gambino crime family underboss Frank DeCicco was killed when his car was bombed. The bombing was carried out by Victor Amuso and Anthony Casso of the Lucchese crime family, under orders of Gigante and Lucchese boss Anthony Corallo, to avenge Castellano and Thomas Bellotti by killing their successors. John Gotti planned to visit Failla that day, but cancelled, and the bomb was detonated after a soldier who rode with DeCicco was mistaken for the boss. In January 1987, Salerno was sentenced to 100 years in prison for racketeering, along with top members of the other New York families, as part of the Mafia Commission trial. Salerno had initially been billed as the boss of the Genovese family. However, shortly after the trial, Salerno's longtime right-hand man, Vincent "the Fish" Cafaro, turned informant and told the FBI that Salerno had been a front for the real boss, Gigante. Cafaro revealed that the Genovese family had been keeping up this ruse since 1969. FBI bugs had captured a conversation in which Salerno and Capo Matthew Ianiello were reviewing a list of prospective candidates to become made members in another family. Frustrated that the nicknames of the potential inductees had not been included, Salerno shrugged and said, "I'll leave this up to the boss." The Oddfather was reclusive and almost impossible to capture on wiretaps, speaking softly, eschewing the phone, and even at times whistling into the receiver. He almost never left his home unoccupied because he knew FBI agents would sneak in and plant a bug. Genovese members were not allowed to mention Gigante's name in conversations or phone calls. When they had to mention him, members pointed to their chins or made the letter C with their fingers. During Gigante's tenure as boss of the Genovese family, after the imprisonment of John Gotti in 1992, he came to be known as the boss of all bosses, despite the position being abolished in 1931 with the murder of Salvatore Maranzano. From 1978 to 1990, 4 of the 5 crime families of New York, including the Genovese family, rigged bids for 75% of $191 million, or about $142 million, of the window contracts awarded by the New York City Housing Authority. Installation companies were required to make union payoffs between $1 and $2 for each window installed. The Oddfather was indicted along with other members of 4 of the New York crime families for conspiring to rig bids and extort payoffs from contractors on multi-million-dollar contracts with the New York City Housing Authority to install windows. Gigante attended his arraignment in pajamas and bathrobe. Due to his defense stating that he was mentally and physically impaired, legal battles ensued for 7 years over his competence to stand trial. In June 1993, the Chin was under indictment again, charged with sanctioning the murders of 6 mobsters and conspiring to kill 3 others, including Gambino boss John Gotti. At sanity hearings in March 1996, Sammy "the Bull" Gravano, former underboss of the Gambino crime family, who became a cooperating witness in 1991, and Alphonse "Little Al" D'Arco, former acting boss of the Lucchese family, testified that Gigante was lucid at top-level mafia meetings, and that he had told other gangsters that his eccentric behavior was a pretense. Gigante's lawyers got testimony and reports from psychiatrists that from 1969 to 1995, Gigante had been confined 28 times in hospitals for treatment of hallucinations, and that he suffered from dementia rooted in organic brain damage. In August 1996, senior judge of the United States District Court for the Eastern District of New York, Eugene Nickerson, ruled that the Chin was mentally competent to stand trial. He pleaded not guilty and had been free for years on a $1 million bail. He had another cardiac operation in December 1996. On June 25, 1997, his trial started with him in a wheelchair. On July 25, 1997, after almost 3 days of deliberations, the jury convicted him of conspiring in plots to kill other mobsters and of running rackets as head of the Genovese family. Prosecutors stated that the verdict finally established that he was not mentally ill, as his lawyers and relatives had long maintained. On December 18, 1997, he was sentenced to 12 years in prison and fined $1.25 million by Judge Jack B. Weinstein, a lenient sentence due to Gigante's age and frailty, who declared that the Genovese boss had been finally brought to bay in his declining years after decades of vicious criminal tyranny. While in prison, he maintained his role as boss of the Genovese family, while other mobsters were entrusted to run the day-to-day activities of the family. Gigante relayed orders to the crime family through his son, Andrew, who visited him in prison. On January 23, 2002, he was indicted with several other mobsters, including his son Andrew, on racketeering and obstruction of justice charges. Prosecutors accused him of continuing to rule his family from prison, and that he used Andrew to funnel messages to the family. They also wanted him held responsible for causing a 7-year delay in his previous trial by feigning insanity. Several days later, Andrew was released on a $2.5 million bail. Federal prosecutor Roslyn R. Mouskopf had planned to play tapes showing him fully coherent, careful, and intelligent running crime operations from prison. Faced with this evidence, the Oddfather pleaded guilty to obstruction of justice on April 7, 2003, just hours before the trial was to start. Judge Leo Glasser sentenced him to an additional 3 years in prison. Mouskopf stated, "The jig is up. Vincent was a cunning faker, and those of us in law enforcement always knew that this was an act." The act ran for decades, but today it's over. The Oddfather died on December 19, 2005, at the Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri. His funeral and burial were held 4 days later on December 23 at St. Anthony of Padua Church in Greenwich Village, largely in anonymity.